conversation about North Carolina's Green Books with Lisa R. Withers, who's with us today. Also on the screen, you can probably see my colleague Heather, who's on here as Cape Fear Museum. And we're delighted to have you come and talk with us today, Lisa, and also to have an audience. You may have heard we are recording this. That means we'll probably play it again and at least have access to it later. I'm going to give people a couple, maybe a minute more, just to make sure that there's folks, if there are folks out there just hopping on, that they come in, and then we'll get our conversation started. All right, so why don't we go ahead? We're hosting this conversation. Cape Fear Museum is hosting this conversation because we have the Oasis Spaces North Carolina's Green Book exhibit up in our museum through August 29th. And we're delighted to have Lisa R. Withers with us. And she is one of the folks who is involved with that exhibit. And so, Lisa, let's talk a little bit about your professional background, how you came to this topic, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, well, good afternoon, everyone. I am excited to join you for this lunchtime conversation about the Oasis Spaces Traveling exhibit and the North Carolina Green Book Project. As mentioned, my name is Lisa. I am a native North Carolinian. I actually grew up in the Triad region of North Carolina, not far from the Virginia border. And that is actually where I started working in this field in 2012. A museum opened in my home county. I started as a volunteer, that turned into a job, realized that it is a potential career path. And so I started in 2012, and since that time, I've worked at various institutions, from historic sites to historic house museums, and also in archives, doing a range of work from providing interpretive tours to curating exhibits and processing collections. And I have also taught U.S. history survey classes to undergraduate students at the university level. And so where I am now doing the work in the field for the past almost 9 years or so, really piqued my interest in some of the questions about the field and wanted to continue developing in research. And so I decided to go get a PhD. So that's also what I'm doing at this time. I'm currently a doctoral candidate in the history department at North Carolina State University. And my dissertation is also on the Green Book. And in it, I am doing some additional work and focusing on the people who are affiliated with the places listed in the Green Book, as well as looking at Green Book listings within their local history context along US Highway 29, which is a major north-south corridor in North Carolina, as well as US Highway 70 going east to west. So getting a cross section of the state, if you will. So that's about it for my background.
So you really are the expert on this topic in this region.
one of them.
Yeah. Well, we're delighted to have you here with us today. So could you tell us about the North Carolina African American Commission's Green Book Project, your role in it, and the exhibit that's on display here at the Cape Fear Museum?
Definitely, sure. So the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, it is a state agency whose mission is to preserve, protect, and promote African American history, art, and culture across the state of North Carolina. And so they were able to receive a federal grant and to do this project, which is doing project is one of the ways in how they are able to meet their mission as a state agency. And so with the federal grant, they were able to hire myself and a few other people to create a team with the end goal of increasing awareness of, one, the Green Book itself. That was a question I asked all the time when I was working on the project. And initially the answer was no, never heard of it. Then the movie came out and they like, yeah, about it? Like, yes. So that was one of the things they sought to do before the film came out. They were doing this before that, but then also raise awareness of the places. And that's really what the project was about, raising awareness. And so with the work that the team was able to do, working for the commission, was able to produce two key things. One is a web portal. So it's a website that lists some of the information that was found as part of that. It is a 2-year project. So I was on it from 2018 through 2020 as part of that grant. And then the traveling exhibit, which is currently on display at the Cape Fear Museum. And so I believe you also asked what was my role with the project. And so as I mentioned, I worked on the project for 2 years from 2018 through 2020. And I was hired to help lead the research that went into, again, this is primarily in awareness. And so really the main thing we were trying to do was not just identify, but start compiling some information, key information that really just lets people know, like, hey, did you know not only this existed, but this was also included. And so when it comes to, there are over 300 places listed for the state of North Carolina. So of course, there's a lot more research that can be done, but you have to start somewhere with that. And so, so my role was leading the research for it. There were other members, as I mentioned, who were hired. We worked together as a team. And we did a combination of archival research to start trying to identify some things of what we could begin to learn about some of the places, as well as working with community members. And we were incredibly fortunate to be able to connect with community members across the state, including in Wilmington. So I do want to give a huge shout out to some of Wilmington's community members who were willing to talk to us and even partner with us to share some information that we were able to learn. And that information we included in what ultimately became the traveling exhibit, as well as some is in the portal as well. And so in a nutshell, that was my key role in leading some of the research.
Yeah, so we met, I think, when you came and gave a talk at St. Stephen as a part of the project. And then it was really great when we saw the exhibit to see Tony Gray's parents, the Gray family, on the exhibit, and to know that that connection had been made and that it's now something that goes statewide. So we appreciate that we see Wilmington in the exhibit.
Yeah.
Although we do have 50 sites, right? So we should be in, the county should be in the exhibit.
So it depends on how you count. I was actually going back through some of my notes, and between Wilmington and Charlotte are the two places, and both cities are in the 50s, but it comes down to how do you count? And so what I mean by that is there are some places that are listed multiple times, sometimes because they're located one place, but then they moved. There are some places where the businesses actually went by several names. And so in the ballpark of the 50s.
Yeah, I hear you. You always think these questions are going to be easy, like how many? And then when you do historical research, you realize there's no such thing as a simple question. Even the first is sometimes so complicated.
Yes.
So could you give our listeners a little bit of a sense of what the exhibit covers and the kind of ways that it looks at the Green Book sites?
Yes, and so kind of as I mentioned, we were very fortunate, and I am always grateful. I always want to give credit and props to community members in North Carolina who are so willing and interested in engaging in this work. And so that is which we aimed to have reflected in the exhibit, is that it is an exhibit that is curated based on and driven by community voices and stories. And so if you're able to come to the museum, which I encourage everyone to do, come to the Cape Fear Museum, see the exhibit. Hopefully you'll notice the use of quotes that came from the oral history. So our team was able to collect about 50 oral histories between 2018 and 2019. And we used that primary source material of what the community members said about the communities in which these Green Book places were located, the people, when people shared memories of the people who owned some of these places, as well as what community members in North Carolina shared about their experiences with travel. So throughout the quotes is what helps guide you through each of the panels and each of them. And we also use the exhibit to engage with, respond to, and expand the scholarly knowledge at that time about the Green Book. And so if you were to go onto Google or any other search engine and put in Negro Motorist Green Book, if you put in Green Book, you'll mostly get the film, but if you do Negro Motorist Green Book, you'll get other kinds of search results. There is a popular narrative that currently exists, mostly about traveling in cars, mostly leisure travel. And that is true. That is very true. But something that became very evident in talking to community members was travel within the Black community happened in a variety of ways and for a variety of reasons. And so we wanted to illustrate that. So for example, I believe in one of the panels with one of the individuals from Wilmington that we were able to do an oral history with, this particular community member mentioned being in the military and also mentioned about in the military traveling by train and how once you reached a certain point, generally the Mason-Dixon line, things changed. Like how even though you're in uniform or not being in the military, Jim Crow in many ways still applied. And so definitely, wanted to go beyond the narrative that already exists about going to the beach or vacationing to also prompt think thoughts about the different ways Black African Americans traveled, because for a lot of the people who participate in our oral history, the main mode they talked about was walking. A lot of people didn't, they talked about cars for those who have them, but also keeping in mind what percentage of the community may have had cars, especially as you go from the 30s through the 60s, that changed over the decades. But many communities, they talked about trains. A few people talked about planes, a few of that, not many, but most people talked about either walking or riding the bus, whether that be the local bus or riding something like Greyhound or Trailways, especially if they're crossing state lines. And so it does that. Another thing that is touched on in the exhibit was really, we tried to not focus so much on the Green Book itself as a publication, but more so on the places, and then there's also the people. And so with that, we also bring out stories of life in North Carolina during the Jim Crow era. Some of the places that are highlighted, it gets mentioned to how people entered entrepreneurship. They either went from farming to a business owner or tell some other story about how the industry of travel, the business of travel was more than just trying to get from point A to point B, but also social economic mobility as well. With that. And there are several stories across the state that also attest to that as someone who wanted to start something for themselves, and being included in the Green Book was one of the ways in how we can now not only know, but also remember their mark that they left on the community and being part of a larger story as well.
So we've had this part of the conversation, but it does strike me that maybe I should have asked this first. And can you tell us who Victor Green was and what a Green Book is, just in case there's anybody who's joined us who doesn't actually know those things?
Yeah, no worries. I also have to remind myself because again, like with the feature film,
you're such an expert that it ends up these things, but let's just cover the basics just for some in case there's anybody who doesn't have that information.
Yes. So Victor Green, Victor H. Green, he was a postal worker in Harlem, New York. He started the publication, the Green Book, in 1936. And it was something that he continued to publish for the next 30 years. It was mostly him. At one point in time, his health did start to fail. And for a few editions, it was actually his wife, Alma Green, who published it. And it was a team of women who also for a few of the editions, I think this is about in the 50s. And then the last two editions, which were biennial editions, the Victor Green Publishing Company was bought out by two other individuals, but they published the last two editions with Victor Green's name on it in keeping with that tradition. So yes, Victor Green was a postal worker. He wanted to create something to help African Americans be able to travel. Particularly, I believe his wife Alma was from Virginia. I need to double check on that. But he had done some traveling himself and was aware of some of the difficulties that could occur in that endeavor. And so he started publishing. The first edition was mostly for the New York metropolitan area, but over time it grew. So something I always try to point out is that the Green Book covered all 48 continental United States, or majority of them. And so it's not just a Southern thing. It included New England, Midwest, the West, Southwest as well as international listings as well. And so especially as you get towards the 50s and the 60s, when you look at those editions, you find listings for various countries in Central and South America, Africa, and Europe also. And so, yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about the kinds of businesses that were listed in the Green Book's pages? I think most of us would imagine there might be gas stations and places to stay and eat, but it's a lot more than that, right?
Yeah, well, one of the listings that caught me off guard initially were beauty shops and barber shops were included in there as well. But most, you see, as you're appealing, there are different lodgings. Oftentimes they either were listed either as hotels, motels, or tourist homes. You did have barbershops, beauty salons, restaurants. You had nightclubs that were listed in there as well as gas stations and auto service stations or garages. All the various terms were used. And it's interesting because the Green Book changed over time. And so when you look at some of the early editions in the late 30s and the 40s, things are listed generally first by state, then by town, then by each of the different category subheadings until about the mid 50s when those categories go away and things are listed then by state, then by town, okay, like all together. So you only get those subheadings for like the first 10 or 15 years of the life of the publication's lifetime. And I would also like to note something else I always like to try to bring up because it's not mentioned a lot, is that the Green Book also had essays as well. And it's something that's not talked about a lot. And so for most editions, there is an essay that highlights a particular city within the United States, and really more like a things to go see, to drive around the city by. So I know there's like Chicago, I think, of course, as I try to list them, it goes off top, I lose the list. But there are several cities that highlight, but then also there's list of safe driving tips that are included in there, as well as a variety of essays. And some of the earlier years, like there's a whole spread on like the latest models of all the major brands of cars there. But even in the 1960, I think it's the 1963 edition, they include an essay about civil rights, what's going on in civil rights, and a list of state by state of this state has these Jim Crow laws in the books. This state does not have, they've repealed them all. And so I share that because I think it's really important to emphasize that the Green Book was more than just a list of places. It really was information of a variety of various types that people need to know as they leave home going from point A to point B.
So can we go back to the safe driving tips? Because are those tips for, don't drive over the speed limit, or are they tips to help you navigate through traveling while Black? Or is it a combination of the two? I'm just wondering what safety meant in that case.
Yeah, so I think I'm trying to recall. Do I need to go back and look at them, which I encourage everyone to look at the actual primary source itself. You can through the New York Public Library. They have the whole collection digitized. A lot of the safety driving tips were more so, I think it'd be a combination, because again, they had some things about like, before you start your trip, make sure you get your car checked out by a mechanic, which I think it's kind of like both, like it's practical for your car, but also you don't want to be a Black person stranded on the side of the road, day or night. So there's that, but then also other practical things like, I remember on some of them it was, make sure to make your reservations in advance. So they did advocate plan your trips in advance, which was again a dual thing because you want to plan, but also when you get there, it'd be one way to hopefully eliminate having to drive around trying to find some place. Although there are plenty of narratives in which people did make reservations, but when they showed up, they're like, all of a sudden there are no reservations. We're full suddenly. So yeah, I would say it's a combination. But definitely please check out the digital collections in the New York Public Library. I think the publication itself makes an interesting read, and no two editions are alike.
So you've talked about how the publication changed over time. What do you think that tells us about either how it was used or changes in society? Because there is a big difference between the 1930s and the 1960s in terms of perceptions about race, but also just in terms of, like you already said, access to cars, all kinds of things are different. And I just maybe it's too hard to see those links, but I wondered if as you're looking at this stuff, you're making connections to the broader history of the state or the states, and just kind of thinking those things through.
I think as far as like, what is it that we learned? I think we learned that a publication like the Green Book was responsive to its time. Like, it wasn't static. And I would say that perhaps as we all continue to learn and grow and move forward, that there could be different ways that we can both remember and interpret the publication, because so often you just hear it called just as a travel guide and it listed these places. But as you look at the nuance of all the different things that were included in it and how it changed over time, it was more than that. It was responsive. So something that I started looking a little bit more into and reading, because there are now 3 books now that have been published since the exhibit was launched. And something that some of the other scholars who also have begun studying this topic are pointing out is that when in the 1930s and pre-World War II, essentially, when cars are becoming more mainstream in American society in general, you do have the racism that accompanies that, and that, oh, Black people are inferior, therefore they can't drive machines, they can't handle and do all that. But when you look at the drawings within and some of the illustrations within the Green Book, I think the essays also point to this. The Green Book did a lot of social and cultural work in that way, and like responding to other portrayals of African Americans in terms of travel and automobiles that you would find in other publications, such as political cartoons, for example. Historians of technology have demonstrated and have pointed out and how oftentimes there were racist caricatures and suggesting that Black people could not participate in that way. And I think that's one way in how, you see that change over time, because as I already mentioned, in the 1960s, they had this essay about, the civil rights, and it shouldn't be lost upon us that that particular edition, 1963, would have come out more than likely when Congress deliberating the Civil Rights Act of 1963. Like, it is, so what we see with all the changes, when we pay attention to some of the smaller details about the publication, it was something that it provided a service in and of itself through its printed pages. It was also responding more broadly socially to what was going on within American society as it related to Black people.
That's great. That's really interesting to think about how it reflects and it changes and reflects the society both at the same time, and how sources can help us see the past, but also think about it in different ways. So I think that's a really interesting way to look at this Green Book. So could you, so we're here in New Hanover County, and we are, the Cape Fear Museum, but we are part of the county government, and we're, our mission is to interpret local history. And so would you be able to share some of the stories of our local Green Book sites with us at this point?
Yes, and so I do want to emphasize, like, a lot of the work that we did was mostly compiling, but as I mentioned, I talked with community members. We were fortunate that some did have stories to share with us. We also had a member of our team who primarily stayed more so in the archive side of things. And so this team member was able to find out some things. And so I do have 3 Wilmington Green Book sites that were that I found interesting. And so just to give like a very high level brief, like, this is some interesting like facts about these 3 places. And so one is Johnson's Barbershop. It's actually listed in the Green Book in 2 different ways, in 2 listings. And so you find it listed as Johnson's Barbershop at 6 Market Street and Johnson's Barbershop at 902 Castle Street. But what's interesting and what our team member discovered is that these 2 listings actually represent 2 generations of the same family. And so the Johnson family, and really this team member was able to go back and figure out the 3 generations of Johnsons who were barbers in Wilmington. And so you have Jacob Johnson Sr., who was born in Wilmington about 1849. Eventually, this team member found him out, I think it's in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where he enlisted in the United States Colored Troop during the Civil War. But they eventually came back to Wilmington. And when he came back, he started barbering. And so then he had two sons, Jacob Johnson Jr. and Samuel, who were barbers. And they were the ones who had the first shop. And then Samuel had two more sons, Thomas and Henry, who were also barbers, and then they had the other shop that's listed in the Green Book. And so, one of the reasons I find this listing really interesting, because being able to from this primary source, the Green Book, when you just look at the page, it's like, oh, I guess they're like two, if you're comparing them, the different editions, because I don't think they appear all in the same editions, but you're like, oh, like, there's Johnson's Barbershop, one here, and then one it showed up in here. And it's not until you delve deeper and look like, well, who asks questions, like, who are the people and where do they come from? And like, what role do they play within Wilmington? Do you then begin to make those background connections? Like, oh, this is like one family and 3 generations lived in this city. And within 2 of those generations, they each had their barbershop listed in this publication that is now known and remembered of helping African Americans be able to travel throughout the United States. And so that's one listing that, again, one of our team members was able to do some digging and made those connections. And I just found it to be really interesting. And we see that in other parts of the state as well. For example, in Raleigh, there's a hotel where one generation started the hotel and went by one name. We were able to connect with the descendants, and that's how we ultimately was able to connect it together, because there's another hotel at that same address, but by a different name, and come to find out when the first generation died, the niece came and took over the business, renamed it, and it was also listed in the Green Book as well. And so it's like just being able to make those relationships and those connections between different listings and in different editions of the Green Book, like kind of going back and forth through all the editions. Sometimes I'm a bona fide nerd in a good way. So it's exciting. And so we do have that. Another Wilmington listing that I found interesting from the archival research that one of our team members was able to do, it's Hill's Restaurant. And so Hill's Restaurant is listed in the Green Book at 604 Red Cross Street, but it was owned by Frank C. and Lulu Freeman Hill. And so Lulu Freeman, she was the daughter of Robert Bruce Freeman, who left her with some beachfront property when he died. And it's my understanding this is what eventually became Freeman Beach. And so the couple, Frank and Lulu Hill, they actually lived in New York for a period of time, but then they came back to Wilmington. And they opened Monte Carlo by the Sea Resort, I believe in the 1950s, at Freeman's Beach. And what our team member was able to find out about this particular Green Book listing in this associated family really does exemplify some of the difficulties African-American experiences while traveling, because you couldn't just automatically take a straight shot from point A to point B, because it may have involved going across places or through territories, for lack of a better word, where you were not welcomed. And so at one point in time, Frank Hill, he started a ferry business so that African-Americans could get from one point, cross over so that they can actually get to Freeman Beach and to the resort, Monte Carlo by the Sea. And then at another point in time, Frank Hill was forced to build a gravel road that supposedly went from 7th Street out to Freeman Beach so that they could have a way to get through and get to the beach resort. What our researcher also found that unfortunately the creation of the inlet at Carolina Beach in 1952, Hurricane Hazel in 1952, and Hurricane Connie in 1954 were 3 factors that unfortunately led to not just erosion of the beach itself, but also the 2 hurricanes destroyed it, each of the beach at that time. And so following those business losses, the Hills eventually moved their businesses back into the city of Wilmington, and then they started Hill's Restaurant, which again was at 604, I believe, and then they also had a teenager youth center that I believe was at 608 Red Cross Street. And I'm not a native of Wilmington, so let me tell you, I'm from the triad. Yeah, I'm from the triad of North Carolina, so that's why I say, it's from what we were able to find, because again, it makes a difference when you're from the area and but I believe Freeman Beach now is known as Freeman Park. And so again, like, and I share this story of this particular Green Book list because it's so interesting, the backstory, but also apparently there have been a long history of legal battles associated. And
yes, there have.
Yeah, legal battles. And that is, that is interesting. We found a number of our people or the people associated with Green Book listing were involved in the legal system, not as lawyer, but lawsuits. For example, in Kinston, one of the individuals who owned a auto shop ended up taking various people to court several times for desegregation cases. And we do have that, also see that with the third Wilmington Green Book site that I would like to just mention a few things about. We were very fortunate, thanks also to you, Jan, for helping facilitate this connection, to talk to family members of the Gray family. Dr. Samuel James Gray, he, fascinating individual, family is awesome, to really enjoy working with them. But Dr. Gray, he's from Kinston, Jamaica, which is another dimension of Black travel. So often, I think when we talk about the Green Book, the focus tends to be on the South because of the reputation that the South has, but also forgetting that we have a bigger diaspora, and that there are many people who are traveling in and out internationally as well. And Dr. Gray is an example of that. Being someone who was from Jamaica, he came to the United States first through New York, and then traveling down south as he pursued his medical training. I believe he did train at Lincoln Hospital in Durham, a famous African-American hospital, and he set up practice here in Wilmington. But Dr. Gray, I find him interesting because he had so much going on, because he had his own medical practice, Gray Clinic, but he also had Greyhound Taxi, which is listed in the Green Book, Del Morocco Nightclub, also listed in the Green Book, as well as Rainbow Laundry and Rainbow Barbershop. And so, I'm like, my man, it's a lot going on. But another reason why I share about Dr. Gray and emphasize some of his entrepreneurial pursuits is because there are historians of African-American history and of labor who have made the connections and pointed to that entrepreneurship in of itself was used as a tool of resistance. Because if you can have autonomy over your land, over yourself, over your labor, you have a little bit more freeway to resist and do some of the things that we see, particularly in the 20th century in the civil rights movement, some of the things that wouldn't be possible if there weren't people who were able to be sole entrepreneurs or, their own bosses, so to speak.
Yeah, and we've been really lucky to have a long relationship with the Gray family, who have donated some really great artifacts to our collection. And also we've done a couple of little exhibits, but yes, it's an amazing story. And I think that, Dr. Gray is one of the people who helps desegregate the hospitals here, so there's a direct civil rights connection there. He went to Howard, I think, actually, rather than Lincoln, but he may have done a training in Durham as well. He did his residency there and then came here for community hospital.
Further training.
Yeah. So did you also talk to anybody from Payne's Hotel? That's one of the longest running local businesses. The Guest House is owned by the Charles and Annie Mapes Payne, and then I think is now maybe owned by the Lofton family. It's another one of those ones where when you start looking at it, there's all these amazing connections, including Maids Park. Was the land for that was donated to the city by Annie Maids Payne's. So she's actually responsible for a park in the city through her family's land ownership and entrepreneurship.
There you go. Like I said, we were able to talk with Mr. Lofton a few times. Actually, it's his story about being in the military.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to be like, let people go see and make the connection. But I actually did not know about the park. But again, also, whole state, 300 plus. When we were able to stop and dig a little bit, we could, but then we also had to be sure we met certain criteria of our project. So, I tell everyone, the state project was intended to bring awareness, But especially for people, if you're interested in local history or the history in your backyard, please, there is still so much more to learn, to research, to uncover about all the listing across the whole state. If seeing this exhibit or hearing this conversation piques your interest in any way, please, I encourage you, join with us, dig with us, because it takes everyone, especially if you have local connections and know people. Yep, that's how we can continue this work.
So are there any other favorite Green Book business stories that you'd like to share with us?
I don't know if I would say favorite per se, but the one that I have a tendency to talk about all the time is the YWCA in Asheville. And I was thinking about it the other day. It's like, why do I have such an affinity for that particular listing? But I think it's because it is a good example of the spirit of the Green Book and not just the spirit of the Green Book, but also just the nature of one element of the Black community. And so to put some context and some meat around what I'm saying, the YWCA was listed for a number of years for Asheville in the Green Book. They had two locations, one on College Street, and then they moved to another part of town, the Ashland Avenue. And when doing some archival research up in Asheville, was able to find this collection of oral histories that were done back in the 90s, like when I was a wee little kid, way before I knew about it. I was alive, but I was little. So, but it was very interesting to read about, and it wasn't necessarily a collection of oral histories about the YWCA. It was really just trying to document the history of Asheville through the eyes of Black women who called Asheville home. And it so happened that so many of them were members of the YWCA. But how this relates to the Green Book is that many of them, or a number of them, talked about how there were rooms in one of the buildings associated with, but also this dormitory. And one of the key reasons they did that was because there were apparently lots of women who were coming from more rural areas of Western North Carolina into Asheville looking for work. But one of the hangups or a potential barrier is if you don't have a place and address or place of residence, that could prevent you from getting the work that you're looking to get. And so seeing this listing, the YWCA function in this way, I think is also a good example of of the Green Book. Essentially is to try to help you overcome this barrier by sharing information, by pointing you to the way to go. All the time, when I was working on this project, and even still now, community members will ask me, well, why is such and such place not listed? Or why is this other place not listed? The Green Book, I have yet to come across anything especially written by Victor Green himself, or anything related to the company at that time that said, our objective is to list every single Black business. It didn't, not by far, by long shot. So there's still a lot of places that were not listed. But I think what the takeaway from that is, like the YWCA being a place where you can network and have an entry point to help you get where you need to go, the Green Book did the same thing. It listed some places that were submitted either by a form, which is included in the Green Book. You could, on the back page, you could write the name and address of a place and send it in to them. Mm-hmm. So whether it was submitted that way, it really functioned as a point of entry to help you identify, okay, where is the Black section of town? Realistically speaking, when you look in the group, you can find where the Black people at, and then hopefully, even if it's someone, they may not be able to take you or point you there, they will help you get to the next person somewhere within that area who could then point you in the right direction to where you needed to go. So
yeah, so if you ended up on Red Cross Street in Wilmington because of the Green Book, you could have actually gone to a whole bunch of restaurants, a whole bunch of beauty parlors, and you might not have ended up at the Green Book listing, but you were in the right place to make those connections.
You're in a safer place than if you ended up in another section of town, you're like, oh, we don't want to be here. Mm-mm. Yeah. So I hope that makes sense. It's something I'm still wrestling through and talking about, but I've been thinking about that quite a bit.
No, history's messy and it's never clear, and it's always really great to hear somebody thinking things through. So I can see that we're kind of getting near to the end of time, but we do have a question from an audience member. And it says, do you know if any of the businesses that predate the 1898 massacre were mentioned in the Green Book? Which I have to say, I don't know. So, so it's a great question.
So I cannot, that is a great research question. What comes to mind possibly might be Johnson's, because as I mentioned, the eldest of that generation, he fought in the Civil War. He was in the USCT. After the Civil War, came back to Wilmington and started barbering. He's the example, but I just happen to know because I just happen to be looking at those notes. I can't say that's the one, but that is a very fascinating question. And if I'm not able to get to it, who needs to write a thesis? That is a really good question. That would be fascinating if those connections can be made. So unfortunately, I don't know the answer. As I mentioned, I just happen to be already have been reviewing notes for Johnson and like, oh yeah, forgot about that. But I don't think in the places that we were able, someone on our team was able to do archival research that was uncovered for us pre-Civil War. But again, I think some that are for Wilmington, I think a member of our team was able to get through maybe 10. So there's still 40 more that could possibly have pre-1898 connections.
Yeah, I did a little bit of research when we made our story map to kind of it's mostly when they were in the Green Book, not when they were in business. And there were definitely places that were in business before and in business after the Green Book. But I didn't run into anything that was that early. But I also, like you, I only scratched the surface on the kind of research that could be done.
Yeah.
So let's I don't think, Heather, can you see any other questions? Okay. Let's wrap up. First, I want to thank you for spending the time with us. Want to get that in at least once and probably get it in again at the end. But let's end with, is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you really think folks should know about the Green Book and its history?
I would say, well, two things, and I've already mentioned it, but it's something that I'm really passionate about, and is, if anyone has the interest, please look at the source yourself. So the New York Public Library, if you go to their website, type in Green Book, it brings up the whole digital collection, what they have. I encourage everyone, please spend time flipping through at least 3 or 4 different editions and just see what's there. No two editions are alike. And I do think there's so much more about the Green Book that we could talk about in the public sphere with that. Because again, now if you hear about it, you hear as a travel guide, but may not realize there's so much more that's included in it. So I encourage that. The second thing that I would say is that, the Green Book is fascinating in and of itself, but I would like to encourage the audience to consider in what ways it is one tool in a larger toolbox. When we have opportunity to talk about the civil rights movement, we may not talk about all the specific battlegrounds or arenas in where the fight for civil rights took place, but transportation is one of them. And so I would, as we end our time together, I would encourage your audience to not just come to the Cape Fear Museum and see the exhibit, but also take some time and consider, oftentimes historians place the beginning of Jim Crow legally with Plessy versus Ferguson, which deals with transportation, deals with streetcars. Mm-hmm. And as you keep moving throughout the 20th century, not only do you have more court cases, you start having bus boycotts and the Freedom Riders that also happen as well. And so yeah, the Green Book is important in and of itself, but it's part of it's one tool in a bigger toolbox within a specific arena of transportation. When you study it and see all the different tactics and approaches that African Americans use to be able to participate in American society, I think it helps to create a much richer and more full narrative.
I think that's really great. So
Exactly.
you've already mentioned going to the digital collection at the New York Public Library, and Heather has very kindly put a link into the chat box for our visitors. Are there other sources that you would recommend to people who want to learn more than they can learn, either through our exhibit, through your digital, through the exhibit we have on display, it's not our exhibit, through the digital stuff, through the Green Book project from North Carolina, or through our story map? Are there books that you would recommend or other sites?
I have two things. So one, the Smithsonian Channel, I don't know if anyone likes documentary, but in 2019, I want to say the Smithsonian Channel did make a great documentary about the Green Book and travel, and a lot of it was based off Candace Taylor's work.
Mm-hmm.
She started doing Green Book research like in 2013. She was working with the National Park Service along with Route 66, and that's kind of where her work on the Green Book started. So and it should pop up easily. I don't think it's free to watch anymore, but I think it's a relatively reasonable price. You can check out the Smithsonian Channel Green Book documentary. But as I mentioned, well, I think I mentioned, it may have been in my head, when myself and one of my colleagues who came onto the project team was curating the exhibit, something that we were intentional in doing is try to respond to the scholarship that was available at that time. And such as things go, since the exhibit was curated, we know 3 more books have come out. So
We've lost Lisa for a second.
The title is called Driving While Black, African American Travel and the Road to Civil Rights. It came out in 2020 by W.W. Norton. So that's one book. Another book that most people may have already heard because it's gotten pretty good fair bit of publicity is Overground Railroad by Candace Taylor. Again, also published in 2020. It's called Overground Railroad, the Green Book and the Roots of Black Travel in America. And then the most recent book that has come out is by Mia Bay. It's called Traveling Black, A Story of Race and Resistance, and it's published through Harvard University Press 2021. So yes, for anyone, so I recommend the documentary, which is good. You know, not everyone wants to go, but anyone who really wants to go in depth and you're looking for the most recent stuff, those are the 3 books that I recommend checking out.
Thank you so much.
More in depth. Mm-hmm.
So we have shown the documentary here. We're a Smithsonian affiliate, and I believe we're talking about maybe showing it again in the next month while the exhibit is up. So if you are on here and you're interested in that, check out our website and we'll keep you updated. But at this point, let me thank you again, Lisa, for spending this time with us. This has been really wonderful to hear your thought process, to learn more about the Green Books. And I love that you are encouraging others to go out and do their own research and also to add to the sum of our knowledge. So we're gonna take this moment to say, somebody wrote, thank you very much for a most interesting hour, and they were absolutely right. It was a most interesting hour. So we appreciate you spending this time with us, and thank you to the audience.
Thank y'all for coming. It was a joy and pleasure. Please check out the exhibit at the Cape Fear Museum. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, it was good to see you again.